Okay, we are live for episode 217 of Trek Live. How you doing this morning, Dan?
Doing great. Excited to talk about TOS movies. I know we've done some, you know, covering of maybe each individual ones, but I think it's going to be fun to kind of do some discussions about the whole thing. And we haven't done those discussions in a while, so I think it's good, especially coming off the heels of TOS. I think this is a really good time to talk about TOS movies for sure.
Yeah, I really don't think we've done. I didn't go back and like look at the last 216 episodes in that great detail, but like you said, we've definitely covered most of these movies. I think as individual pieces of Star Trek, going way back, some of them to 5 years ago now. But we have definitely not kind of lumped all six together and looked at them after we've both kind of consumed all six of them in short order. And like you said, right after TOS, kind of looking at it almost like it's the last season of the original series, last little mini run of kind of linked stories to some extent. So it should be fun to kind of, we wrapped TOS, the series, up the last time we were here as part of our rewatch kind of recap in an extended form. But this should be kind of putting the final button on that crew, that cast, that part of Star Trek history. So I'd like to go to you first because you, correct me if I'm wrong, but just my knowing you and knowing how you watch Star Trek, I don't think you watch the movies that often. Like you tend to go, like you're much
Mm-mm.
heavier,
I don't usually.
even really do
I
it,
yeah
right? Like,
yeah. I maybe once my initial rewatch, but my second rewatch, like that, I don't usually watch the movies, but
right.
yeah, it was interesting to come back to it. Especially, I don't know. I like to think about the what was going on during that time. Like, can we, because of these movies, can we attribute to TNG? That's why they came back on TV, is because of the success of these movies. And I just think it's interesting. Every time I hit the movies, it's almost its own little season, right? Because they really flow together. At least the first half of the movies flow together like you're watching a serialized you know season of Star Trek. So
Mm-hmm.
um, I think it's really interesting to see that and to maybe attribute to the success of these movies to TOS and really kickstarting back the franchise after the third season cancellation of TOS. So yeah, a lot of stuff to unpack here, but I really did enjoy it this time around. I'm not sure if it'll make it into my next rewatch, but I think it's always fun to come back to these movies.
Yeah, that's. I definitely think. I mean, I wasn't around for it. I was born in '87, so I don't have the institutional memory of like watching the TOS movies come out and how that kind of um, aligned with the buzz for the next generation or a new show coming out. But I would have to imagine that they're directly linked. The success of these movies, particularly Star Trek 4 in 1986, The Next Generation premiered in '87. I would imagine that Paramount's happiness with Star Trek 4's critical and box office performance, which was very good. I think it was the fifth highest grossing movie of '86. Uh, Probably kind of locked and loaded that the next generation was a go, and they were gonna go back to TV and expand, the Star Trek tent, which definitely is sort of the defining moment for Star Trek becoming like a franchise, for lack of a better term. It's not just a show and some movies that are based on an old TV show. It's this kind of continually growing thing that is more than William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelly and company, Kirk, Spock, McCoy and company. It's a world, not just an individual show. So yeah, these movies are critically important, obviously, to extending Star Trek's life, and just by their nature. I mean, I think we'd be hard pressed to find very many examples. It's more common now, but even now, when movies get made based on old TV shows, they tend to be remakes. Like they tend to be, let's reimagine the show and do it in a
Yeah.
movie format. To take a show that ended 10 years ago and get the same people, put the same cast in place, resume their roles, jump ahead 10 years in time or however long between Turnabout Intruder and Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and kind of continue the story in movie format. Doesn't happen very often, even today, to see that. Downton Abbey comes to mind,
Yeah.
is doing it now. Um,
Yeah.
the X Files did it a couple times. Like it does happen, but I think we'd be hard pressed to find very many examples of it before 1979 when the motion picture came out.
It's almost backwards now, right? If the movie is successful, they
Mm-hmm.
get a TV show. Like I think of just
Right.
like Marvel and the Star,
Star
Wars
Wars.
stuff. If the movie is successful, they get like a 10 episode little mini series. I just find that interesting how the whole platform has changed.
Yeah, definitely. So these are really unique. Jeff is in the chat. How you doing, Jeff? Good to see you as always. Kind of going into the movies more individually, or maybe before we even like kind of go one movie at a time. I don't want to spend too much time. Like, I don't want to necessarily spend 10 minutes on each movie or anything like that. Let's just talk kind of more broadly about them and things that really stand out. But I'm sure we'll hit all 6 of them. Did anything change this time around? Did you find yourself reevaluating things that you were thinking you thought going into watching these movies? Did anything feel fresh and new? Did you come away thinking differently about any of the movies, or did it pretty much kind of validate the way that you remembered them from seeing them originally, and what was in your head?
Well, I think my my perception on some of these movies definitely changed, especially when I watched them in like succession, where it was like I didn't watch one here, there,
Yeah.
and watch one here, Trek After Dark here and there.
Right.
It was like all in a line, and it really felt more serialized this time around,
Yeah.
which I really like. And usually that helps kind of the lower end movies. I think the motion picture definitely helps from just feeling that excitement for watching all the films again. That definitely, I definitely felt some of that
Yeah.
while I was watching it. And then also with with 5, I think it just gets, because it's so serialized, it gets kind of propped up a little bit, and so yeah, it's good. I think the main takeaway here initially is just the watching them in succession and in a row. I think really helps. I think when you kind of drop into the Search for Spock or Undiscovered Country, I think you get a little bit of you don't get the full effect I think you would if you would just like it, just like
Have them all
1 through
fresh.
4 just kind of roll and roll and roll. I just think that it's just really successful that way.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I do think the movies play best, not necessarily as isolated pieces. Because there is, even through Star Trek 5, Star Trek 5 is probably the most standalone of them from like a story perspective. I think the serialized element there is definitely kind of Spock adjusting to being back and kind of getting his mental acuity kind of back aligned and finding his own way. But I think 2, 3, 4 are it's well documented that they do work really well together. They're essentially sequels directly from each other. They're very different movies. The stories, the tones
Yes,
are nothing like each other. But you can't separate that the movies pick up exactly where the last movie left off. So they certainly play well together as in true Star Trek form. Like they're not tonally, not even genre connected necessarily, but it's a continuing story and they build on each other. And then Star Trek 6, in a lot of ways, jumps over Star Trek 5 somewhat, but picks up a lot of things from Star Trek 4, Star Trek 3, with why Kirk feels the way that he does. I think having that institutional knowledge of those previous movies helps Star Trek 6 a lot. So, yeah.
But
go ahead.
you do get a lot of variety, right?
Very.
Like the motion picture is so different
Yes.
from
in every way.
Star Trek Five in every way. So I think that's a really good, um, just a really good aspect of these movies because I think it's at least in the movie industry, it's always I feel like you see some movies trying to recapture some of the original, success of whatever it is, but um, I think they all take a different approach and have differences enough to make it feel um, fresh enough. So, um, yeah,
Yeah, I think the motion picture is different than all of them, really. I mean, certainly, Star Trek 4, Star Trek 5,
own
totally
entity.
different. But in every way, Star Trek 1 looks different. It feels different. It's going for a different. I think it's aimed at scratching a different itch. I think it's more striving to be, a 2001 esque kind of old fashioned science fiction epic, where I think Star Trek 2 becomes, trends into a more insulated, kind of intimate, smaller scale, lean and mean kind of product. And I don't think Star Trek One, the Star Trek the Motion Picture, kind of gets replicated in terms of its scale and its ambition from that standpoint until the Kelvin stuff, until '09 kind of reimagines it and kind of intentionally like pushes everything forward and kind of wipes the slate clean a little bit the way that the motion picture attempts to do. So that makes the motion picture a real interesting piece of Star Trek's history. We've definitely covered it in an individual episode, probably a year or 2 years ago at this point. But it's so I think the uniqueness of that movie and the way that it's such a one-off thing, tonally especially, is makes it a really interesting movie. But what really hits me about that movie that I think does play into what we're talking about with the serialized kind of nature of the 6 movies is the Spock story in the motion picture is really about. I think about the scene in Star Trek 6 when he's talking to Valeris about logic not being the beginning, or not being the end, but it's the beginning, and not kind of being so pigeonholed into completely embracing the Vulcan kind of psyche. He's kind of come to terms with that he's of two halves, and that journey's kind of taken course over the course of the series and the 6 movies. But I think the motion picture is really where that kind of gets initiated, with walking away from the Kolinar and feeling emotionally pulled back to the Enterprise and Kirk and company, and kind of committing to that and coming through his experience with understanding V'ger and what V'ger is just like a pure machine, and not being able to understand anything outside of like computer equations and simple mathematics. That's not the way, and I think that character arc, the journey that Spock goes on, is really kicked off in the motion picture. And because of what I was just saying, I think people kind of shelve the motion picture as an individual thing, as a kind of disconnected piece of Star Trek's story. For all those reasons, I think that's a mistake, because of how much of Spock's story kind of gets initiated in terms of what happens to him later in life at the back end. It gets directly kind of started in that movie.
Yeah, because this is like technically 10 years, after they served on the Enterprise or whatever the timeline
Right.
is. So you definitely get some difference in character, but I think there is some character development through these 6 films.
Yeah.
And not just with Spock, but I think, you can't just...
Kirk, for sure.
Yeah, you can't just, write off that some of these movies you're not going to get some character development. And I think there's definitely some good stuff with Spock, especially.
Yeah, and you can't discount the sort of just... What helps me a lot with the motion picture is if I just imagine myself, because I wasn't around for it, 1979, wanting the original... If I was a fan of the original series when it was on TV and desperately wanted it to come back, sitting in a movie theater and seeing it that big and that, like, fully fleshed out and that ambitious... I can imagine a lot of people were in heaven, watching that. Not necessarily critics, not people stumbling into the movie theater and experiencing Star Trek for the first time, but people who were emotionally invested in wanting to see Star Trek kind of continue and come back in some capacity. I just imagine that score hitting hard. How big and triumphant it is, and seeing Kirk and Scotty in a shuttle pod flying up to a kind of rebuilt, true to form. Definitely, undeniably the Enterprise, but kind of new and improved and beautifully realized. And after, especially in the 1960s, without the reimagined or the remastered original series episodes, the original cuts of the Enterprise, you saw 6-7 shots of the Constitution class Enterprise throughout those 79 episodes. You kind of got the same looks at the ship and feeling like you're in a movie theater looking at all these different angles and bigger than life. Like actually really getting to see the Enterprise had to be an amazing experience. So if I can kind of transport myself back in time a little bit watching the movie and imagine what that was like, that really kind of helps boost even some of the slow cinema kind of pacing that you get in that movie.
Yeah, it's like a giant sci-fi epic that just has the budget of 3 of these films. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sure it's
something
roundabout.
But, it's big.
Do you? I mean, I think I'm going to ask this, but I think it's probably self-evident because of how successful the rest of the movies kind of were and how much they established what was to come. Do you think that it was the right move for Star Trek to go smaller, more intimate? Like, do you think the reaction to the motion picture to go the way that the Wrath of Khan is built and constructed and the kind of movie that is was the right thing? Do you wish there was more like the motion picture, or do you think Star Trek's better served, generally speaking, with the way that the Wrath of Khan Forward kind of presents those movies?
Yeah, I think it's Star Trek's better served like that, like the Wrath of Khan. I think just take a 50-minute episode and kind of elongate it to feature film length. I think you don't have to go this big over the top. I mean, it would be nice to see, but
sure.
I think there's dozens of examples, 800 and some examples of Star Trek that it's just better served in like structurally that 45-minute to 50-minute type of
more modest. Yeah.
More modest. And I think especially with films and the film industry folks so focused on the bottom line right now. I think it's just best to be able to do Star Trek that way. And that's just us as fans, we're conditioned to see Star Trek like that now. I think we're kind of turning a little bit of a different page with some of the shows doing like the 25-minute to 30-minute. I mean, I think that's definitely even more modest, and I think even going into Lower Decks, that takes an adjustment. I think Star Trek is best served in that more modest, kind of nitty-gritty, lean and mean, like you said, type of just elongated episode.
I think it keeps it out of trouble too. I mean, Star Trek has kind of been proven over the last 50 some years that it's not Star Wars, it's not Marvel, like it doesn't quite have that worldwide, especially cachet. It's not going to do global box office the way that some of those other IP, entities can produce. And short of '09, when Star Trek gets produced that way, it tends to disappoint for that reason. And I think part of the reason the Kelvin timeline movies have kind of stalled out and have had trouble getting going again is, like, how do you do it? I think the right answer for Star Trek is to go maybe a little smaller and avoid becoming a ginormous sprawling motion picture production that's going to struggle to make its money back.
And I'm not saying that we stop doing movies. Mm-hmm. I'm saying like there's plenty of examples, not just in the Star Trek universe, where movies will come out on a streaming service, like then all the Netflix original
content,
content that can be just as successful as some of these box office hits.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's the right path for kind of where we find ourselves right now. I think that's probably the clearest path to success, and whether or not that's possible with Kelvin timeline cast is remains to be
Uh,
seen. It doesn't seem like that,
yeah.
but that's probably the business model from Star Trek's history. I think that seems the most likely to succeed, as opposed to trying to mimic what '09 was able to do as kind of the restart, ultra accessible, entry level kind of Star Trek movie. Once you start building and having sequels and a more complicated story, it's hard to kind of recapture that accessibility. So I agree. I think the Star Trek 2 model has been proven to be kind of the path, and that's been an important development for Star Trek's development and growth. Yeah, yeah, it just creates that kind of dividing line between 1 and 2. That's kind of like it keeps one sort of on an island in a lot of respects, and especially because it is such a different movie, it's easy for folks who might not respond to the movie that strongly, might not be a big fan of it. Jeff in the comments just talked about one of his big changes in Star Trek life is kind of the evolution of his opinion of the motion picture. And I think a lot of people do experience that. I think a lot of kids, young people, watch that movie and are like, "What? This isn't Star Trek," and lean more to 2, 3, 4, 6 for that kind of flavor. But I feel like a lot of people have come back to the motion picture, but those who don't like it, I think, can easily kind of isolate it and avoid it because it is so different in a lot of ways. But it has those serialized elements like we're talking about with some of the character development that comes initiating some of those threads. What do you think of? Well, let's just jump in because I'm sure this will kind of prompt maybe our conversation. I got to peek at it because you sent it to me. How would you rank the 6 movies? Just off the top of your head, and just I'm curious to get into this a little bit and see where our differences are. And I don't think we have very many. I think there might be just one flipping of movies. But what would your...
So my ranks are number 1. Would be 4.
Boy Show, yeah.
Number 2 is number 2, Wrath of Khan. 3, Undiscovered Country. 4, Search for Spock. I really do love that one. I think it's probably where the flip's going to come. And then 5, obviously, is motion picture. And then 6, rounding out the rankings,
Final Frontier.
Star Trek 5. So, yeah.
How many of the movies would you... I know you don't grade, but if you were doing a Siskel and Ebert style thumb up, thumb down kind of thing, would you give all of them thumbs up? Would you give the Final Frontier a thumb down? Like, where would you kind of divide success and not success as a Star Trek fan watching Star Trek movies?
I'd give 5 probably a thumb down.
Okay.
The story just... I mean, there's some... Don't get me wrong. There's some really funny, interesting moments in that movie. Right, but I think just story and tonally just is a miss for me. And especially with the company that it's around, I think does not help that film at all. So yeah, that's probably the only one that I'm saying thumbs down to.
Well, we're pretty much in the exact same boat. I would say that too. I think the one that I would go like below a B minus C plus on is the Final Frontier. The ranks are the same, except I would have 2 at 1. The Wrath of Khan is my number 1. The Voyage Home is my number 2. The rest of it is the same. Undiscovered Country at 3. Search for Spock 4. Motion Picture 5. Final Frontier 6. So pretty close. That, in my experience on Twitter, kind of polling people's preferences on these movies, it usually comes down to that. It's usually a real close, sometimes 51-49 kind of split decision on 2 and 4. Those movies really do go neck and neck. And I think the rest of the ranks, if we took a giant poll and compiled a bunch of ballots, it would probably, I think it has, when I've done this in different ways over the years, essentially come out to the way we just both ranked 3 through 6 for the rest of those movies, with 6, 3, 1, 5 being the rest after 2 and 4. What kind of gives 4 the edge for you? Like, what makes you a Star Trek 4 guy in that kind of split decision? Which one gets the nod?
I think it just does everything well. I mean, it's a true. It's got some great comedic elements to
It
it,
does.
but I think it's like it's a true away mission type of episode where I think there's a big sci-fi concept
Yeah.
there. There's a morality play where you're after the movie you're still kind of thinking about it. The cast, everyone has something to do,
Yeah.
very vital. Um, yeah, I think it's just all around well-rounded movie. And if I'm going back to my desert island parameters, that's the movie I'm
Yeah.
taking.
Yeah.
But not to say that the Wrath of Khan isn't um, just as good. I just think that the Voyage Home just edges it, and I think people even today should take notes of how to do a sequel, of how to take a story element out of a TV show or a past movie and just expand on it, and then really do a good job of um, not ruining the character at all, not really um, nerfing the character, however you want to spin it. I think just Wrath of Khan does a really good job.
Yeah. True. I agree with all that. I mean, they're really close for me. They're not separated by much. Two is way at the top of my favorite Star Trek things. So that gets the edge for me. But it's no disrespect to 4. I think 2, and it's sort of character driven structure. It's so focused on what makes these people tick. And I think the fearless kind of approach to letting these characters age and kind of embracing the fact that the show is at that point 15 years old, however I think about that, and that these characters are reaching middle age. Kirk is struggling with that. I think that's a human thing, and the right instinct, not to like pretend that he's young still and that he's like a swashbuckling hero. He's aging and he's insecure about it and doesn't know how to handle his place in his career and what he wants to be doing in comparison to what he's capable of doing. And having a character like Savick, Kirstie Alley just passed away, a young up and coming officer who might see things a little differently, kind of waiting in the wings, I think helps that movie a lot, gives that movie a lot of perspective on that theme. And then I always talk about when I find like my absolute favorites, I have that 4 quadrant kind of criteria for my all time favorite. Like what makes a true Star Trek classic for me, in my own subjective opinion. It's like a big science fiction idea, which I think the Genesis device is. This big terraforming idea. It's kind of a MacGuffin in a lot of ways, but I think they do some cool things with building on that idea. Character driven, expanding on characters, developing characters, having emotional resonance, which I think Star Trek 2 undeniably does, and building on the world of Trek and like enhancing the overall sort of universe and timeline, and adding to the whole picture. And I think Star Trek 2 does all 4 of those things in some big ways. But Star Trek 4 does too. I mean, it's not for me, it's really not a, speaking as somebody who ranks, it kind of, I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, because when you rank something, you kind of inherently are this or that. You're picking something, but I want them both. I think they're both all-time classics and some of the best things Star Trek has to offer. The thing that 4 does the best, that has kind of been proven over the years and is sort of undeniable, is Star Trek 4 is probably the thing other than '09 that you could sit somebody like your wife in front of, and they could watch it and get something out of it and enjoy it as its own thing, and not need, tons of background. Yeah, they don't need it. I mean, it helps to have it, but it doesn't make a big difference at all. And a lot of people in 1986 and in the years since have sat down and watched that movie for whatever reason and enjoyed it on its own terms. And I think The Voyage Home, probably First Contact, and '09 are maybe the 3 things that most successfully deliver that. And there are 3 movies that did extremely well in the box office, and I think that's kind of it's in the receipts that's why that they kind of are maybe a cut above in terms of how they perform
Yeah.
that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the movie that probably has the toughest job of all of them is three. Because three is kind of like they're kind of almost pigeonholed in developing that movie. Like you're kind of their hand was kind of forced in terms of they had to do one thing. Like they know where Star Trek 3 has to end if they want to continue the story and do this. They have to bring Spock back somehow. So they're kind of given this
Handcuffed almost.
yeah
To what they have to do.
right. They're very limited in terms of I think how much they can do. They have to pick up on threads left behind by two with the Genesis stuff and where Spock's body is located. Like they just don't have a lot of creative freedom, and I think the way that they successfully do that, and the thing that always strikes me about Star Trek 3, in addition to that, is how much Star Trek stuff you talk about, like enhancing the Star Trek universe. Star Trek 3 introduces the Excelsior space dock, Klingon bird of prey, the Oberth class starship,
A lot
of stuff, props, sets, things that are seen over and over and over again, and are still kind of Star Trek icons, and are so in the visual language of what Trek is. So 3 does a lot of heavy lifting on that front, and maybe does more to expand the visual Star Trek universe than anything ever, maybe. Yeah. We have Jeff sharing his ranks. He says Wrath of Khan. No, he says The Undiscovered Country, Wrath of Khan, Voyage Home, Motion Picture, Search for Spock, and Final Frontier. So a little bit of a different one there. I love that. Nostalgia, the Klingons politics, and Chang put the Undiscovered Country on the top of the list for him. But he says that Wrath of Khan is a superior movie. Undiscovered Country is just his favorite, and that kind of is something that we touch on a lot too. Best favorite,
a lot, yeah.
That's it's sometimes an important distinction to make. Especially in movies like these. You might have an intense, nostalgic, emotional connection to maybe one over the other, but be able to, have an opinion that maybe something else is the more complete product, I guess.
Yeah. Undiscovered Country definitely is a solid choice. I think it's got some really good stuff. Anytime we do Federation talk, articles of Federation stuff, I'm on board with. I think the B plot with the boots kind of has some. It could get easily fixed with internal sensors. Don't we have internal sensors here? But no, I can forgive just one little thing.
Yeah.
Some really great stuff.
For me, the success of 6 is really, I think if Star Trek, the original series, we talked a lot about, over the years we've talked about Star Trek, the original series being this sort of commentary on the emotional versus the logic and decision making and making up a person. But in addition to that, it's the social commentary on things that were happening in the 60s and tensions with the Russians, the Cold War. Star Trek 6 comes out in 91. The end of the Cold War is kind of happening around that movie, having the characters kind of come to terms with how to make peace with an enemy that they've had for their whole life. It's about prejudice. It's about, working through your own preconceptions and things like that. I think that's so true to blue what the original series is kind of all about. And having it end on that note, it feels fitting to me. And I appreciate that, that they found a way to end it talking about the things that the show's been talking about the whole time. That always resonates with me, and I think Shatner's really good in it. I think his character arc just within that movie, dealing with the concept of having to deal with the people who are commonly in position to make decisions like we're going to make peace with this other entity out there are typically people that are very experienced, older, have a lot of baked in preconceptions, a lot of things that they have to get over themselves, and that's the biggest hurdle we have is having people who have all of that experience, getting them to shed some of their experiences and conceptions about the other. And Star Trek 6 takes that on head on, and I think we still deal with that today and are always going to. So I love the message of 6, and yeah, and I have a lot of nostalgia for it. It's the first thing. I can't ever really. I always say it's the first movie I ever saw in a movie theater. I don't know if that's entirely true. Maybe I saw something else, but it's definitely, without a doubt, my first memory of being in a movie theater. It's a very strong memory, and I'm going to stick with it as my final answer on my first movie in a theater. And as you know, anybody that really knows me, I go to the movies a lot. So movie theater is an important, special thing for me. And so Star Trek 6 has a lot of nostalgia for those reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, all good stuff for Underskip Country.
Yeah. We have another guy, another person in the chat. ER Mixon's Craziest Theories is in the chat and says that 6 is his favorite. So we have 2 votes for 6 just in the chat.
Nice.
With
That's
Jeff
good.
and that individual.
Great
So,
mix.
yeah, 6 has a lot of fans. I know our good friend Thad, who's been here with us on Trek Live, is in our server, hangs out with us at Trek After Dark. We know him well. Star Trek 6 is his favorite Star Trek movie. So that's another. There are lots of folks who would cite that as a favorite. So that gets a lot of love. My dad is here and is talking about what we talk about often: difference between best, favorite, emotional connection. His Desert Island movie, I can attest, is Star Trek V. That's true. He loves Star Trek V, but that's different strokes for different folks. That's different story elements and emotional resonance lands on different people in different ways, and Star Trek V's always done it for him. So can't argue with that. But he says Star Trek 2 is the best in his view. How do you think, just based on your memory, this is just a kind of a one-off, and I'm sure we'll double back on these things as we keep going in our rewatch down the road, sometimes in some cases maybe years from now. But if you try to package these movies into like kind of 3 chapters, the Star Trek movies in general, and you have the original, the TNG, and the Kelvin, do you think as a whole the what do you think
This is the most successful.
this is the most successful run of movies?
I mean, Kelvin is probably knocking on the door for sure.
Yeah,
I think it's been pretty
2 out of 3,
but
pretty sizable hits.
yeah, I think just what I can remember from TNG movies, Generations, and those movies, I think that these are just more successful and consistent, and maybe that it is because there's like a little bit of serialization going on here, but I think these are more successful.
I also think that the original series, because as we've talked about a lot, the original series is built on these 3 characters kind of at the center of it. And it's so easily defined as this is what makes this show tick, right? Like it's Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and how they relate to each other. And the Next Generation, in some ways, has similar elements with Picard and Riker and Data, and but it's more of an ensemble show. Like the reasons people loved the Next Generation were different than the reasons people loved the original series. And I think the original series is just, I think, structurally more situated to work in a 2-hour kind of single adventure kind of a movie that would allow for the best traits of that show to be served in a 2-hour movie than the Next Generation just is built to do. I think the Next Generation, First Contact is very successful at capturing the best qualities of the Next Generation in those 2 hours. But I think the other 3 movies have to divert a lot from what what the Next Generation was to work as a 2 hour movie.
Yeah, some of the characters and character elements definitely have to take a backseat, especially with at a 2 hour limit. I
Yeah.
guess.
The other difference, I think, between the two, if we're talking Next Generation TOS, is the weakness of the weak link for me personally with the original movies is the Final Frontier, and the big difference to me that my weak link in the TNG movies is Nemesis, and the big difference between Nemesis and the original and the Final Frontier is the Final Frontier has Star Trek 6. Like it's not the last.
Yeah, it's not the last
right?
one. Yeah.
Yeah, it bounces back, and it's you have another taste when that ends. And I'm hoping it's not a movie, but I'm hoping that Picard season 3 maybe does a little bit to soothe. I don't think anything. Just like I don't think Star Trek 6 makes Star Trek 5 a better movie. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the negative taste in my mouth is stronger for Nemesis because it doesn't have the direct follow up, and a little bit with Picard season 1. I know that's got mixed reception in its own right, but the way that deals with Data's death, I think, doesn't help Nemesis, but it makes Nemesis a little easier to take than it did before that existed for me, speaking just for myself. But I'm hoping that maybe Picard season 3 does the same for the Next Generation as a whole, and maybe makes Nemesis a little just more irritating and not more damaging, as in terms of what it does to the whole picture. Yeah, ER Mixon's craziest theory says the TNG movies have only one really good movie, two middle of the road with some very annoying elements, and one film that just sucks. But nobody ever agrees on which film is which, and that's I agree with that. You do get some mixed mixed takes on that. I the more I'm on Twitter, the more I see people talk about the Next Generation movies, the more often I actually see people kind of emerge who wouldn't label the one that sucks as Nemesis. It surprises me. Like I thought that was more of a given, but you'd be surprised.
Yeah.
There are people who would defend Nemesis and crucify Generations, for example, or Insurrection. But that's the beauty of Star Trek. It's not, doesn't really lend itself to groupthink very much. It's, a lot of different opinions out there. Any other thoughts on these movies, the original series, kind of to tie it up? I think we've touched on all 6 of them in at least some capacity, either from our own comments or from the chats as well. How'd you feel when Star Trek 6 ended? Did you feel satisfied? Did you feel like it ended the...
I did. A little misty for sure. Just because I think just rewatching TOS and then right into the TOS movies, I think it's definitely the way to go. I think that's the best way. But yeah, I felt satisfied. I know endings are tough, especially with Star Trek. We don't do endings well with
Right.
Star Trek.
Not always.
But I think this is definitely one of the best.
Something... Yeah, I agree. I always, for whatever reason, this time around, listening to Kirk's kind of like last log entry at the end of the very, very end of that movie, talking about, this ship will become the care of another crew, and it's going to keep moving forward. But back then, and even it's easy to kind of fall into he's talking about the next generation, basically the next leg of the journey. But I think about it. He's talking about everything. I mean, he's saying Star Trek will continue to evolve, and he's talking about Captain Pike in Strange New Worlds, and he's talking about Michael Burnham and Discovery. Like he's saying it's going to keep going, and it's going to change, and it's going to evolve, but it's all here, and that resonated with me more than it ever has. And I've seen that movie a lot this time around, just for that reason. Anything else? Last thoughts? Did I lose you? I think you might have frozen. I think we lost Dan just in the nick of time. His image is definitely frozen there. Give it a couple seconds, see if he pops back. But we're going to wrap this up. I'll just say that I appreciate everybody in the chat for contributing their thoughts. Definitely helped us along today. And We will be back for another live episode after the new year on January, I think it's 8th. We're going to talk about our favorite episodes of 2022. There were 51, or going to be 51 new episodes of Star Trek in the year 2022, split between 5 series, and it should be interesting to think about individual episodes that really resonated with us across that time. Discovery, Prodigy, Lower Decks, Picard, Strange New Worlds, all on the table. So once the year's all wrapped up and we have all 51 of those episodes in the docket, we'll take a look at that with our first episode back after the new year. So look for that then. If you're interested in joining the Trek Live Discord server, you can send me a direct message on Twitter at TrekFan4387, and I'll happily get you invited. And we have a watch log channel where people share what they're watching. We have a channel for literature, books, Star Trek book commentary, reviews, Star Trek gaming, commentary on the new episodes as they come. Anything you can find, anything you could want to talk about, there's a home for on that server. So feel free to message me on Twitter if you're interested and you're a Discord user. I'll be happy to get you on board. But thank you very much for watching, and we'll see everybody in the new year.